Welcome CSC230 W1 to ex5 float review, and this is going to be a float review, a review on floating and also media query. It should be very quick, but I think floating is something that requires a little bit of review, especially since we're going to get into using CSS Flex, which will kind of eliminate the use of floats. I want you to understand floats before we get past them, because there are some complexities of floats which make things a little more challenging. But in this exercise, it won't look like anything really special. What we'll do is just create 4 paragraphs that are going to float side by side, and we'll just color them so we can see them a little bit differently, and we'll put them in a container. So I'm going to go here and open up in a new tab using this thing. And then when I have it open up, I'm going to collapse this. And this is what it's going to look like. Well, that's actually our main page that we're looking at. And we should put a link to ex5 on there because that's what this is going to be. But since I don't, what I'll do is I'll click on my ex4, which is the last exercise, and then just go in here and change that to ex5. And make sure you put the / at the end. It seems to work better when you do that. And this is what it's going to look like. Now we just have an H1 that just says float review. We have a container, or basically it's a div with a class name container, and it's actually a section. You can use a section element or div element, but I used section element. And then we have 4 divs inside there. And inside the 4 divs are just paragraphs with some lorem ipsum. And when we resize this, we're going to get to a certain point, just one media query we're going to use. We're going to get to a certain point at 620, just like the previous exercise. And then it's going to jump and be 4 columns on top of each other, or 4 rows on top of each other, instead of 4 columns going across. So that's all we're going to do, and we're just going to explore floating a little bit, and also CSS a little bit, just to see how parenting works in CSS, meaning what overrides what, because sometimes it can be a little confusing, and also review the naming process a little bit, because just the way you name things affects how some things override other things. Or when I say override, I mean cascade. That's where the name comes from, cascading style sheets. So that's actually what we're going to do. Just make 4 paragraphs inside a container that have margin around. You can see they all have their own margin around. The container has its own margin. That's why these things are in here. The container has a background color. The divs will have a background color, and that's really it. And then we'll just do a media query that when we get to 620, they jump and stack on top of each other. So that's all we're going to do. Now, just to review a little bit more, we're going to make an ex5 folder. We're going to make an index page, which will be fairly easy to do because we're using Emmet, and it's really easy to generate lorem ipsum. It's very easy to generate just an H1 and all the HTML for that, so we don't have a lot to do. We'll go over the naming process again because that can be a little confusing, and you might wonder, well, why do we have to give it box and box 1? Can we just give it a box 1 name and then use just a general div? And I'll go over all that when we do that, because I think it's worth the time to go over it before we jump into something else. And we're still going to link to an external CSS file. We're still going to do just a real basic reset of margin and padding. We don't have to do a big global reset like we copied the first time. And then we're just going to put a class style for container with just a background of light blue. We're going to give it the overflow auto property so that nothing escapes from it. There'll be padding in it, and then there'll be a general box or div. I'm going to do the div first, but there's going to be a general style for all 4 of the boxes, or all 4 of the divs, that'll have all the things that they share. And then we'll even do separate colors. We'll break them out into their respective class names so that they can all have individual colors. And then we'll just have a media query at the end, which is really easy. It just takes away the float and just makes the width 100. So that's pretty easy to do. You could even copy your media query from your other one to get started. But we'll try to make this as easy and quick as possible. Also, make sure that even when we indent stuff, we'll try to be really good about doing that. They even have a auto format in here. I forget where that is. Unless it's just in the HTML, they have a little auto format button. I don't know if that's going to auto format our CSS or not. I think it does for HTML. Yeah, they have an auto format for HTML, but apparently it doesn't show up for CSS. So we'll try to format it ourselves and keep it looking nice and neat, especially when you get into the media query, because you have the double curly braces here. So it's nice to have that set up so everything's nice and clean and easy to read. And remember, if you ever need to comment something out, you just want to test it, you can always highlight it and do Command ? Or if you're on Windows, do Control ? And that automatically puts a comment in there. And it takes it out too. So if you need to remove it, you can just toggle it and do that. So that's what we're going to do next. So I'm going to get started with that. Coming up, I'm going to delete all this and start from scratch and just kind of talk you through it. Okay, when you sign into Replit, go to My Repels, and you're not going to create a new one. You're going to go to the one that you've already been in, because we're going to make a new folder in there. So just go to your CSC230 W1 repel that you made for your last exercise. And you could close up well, you can actually keep this here right now, because what you could do is, if you see your first file that's here, I'm going to move this over a little bit. If you see your main index file, your main one in your CSC230 W1, just copy this and put a link to ex5. Just call this ex5. And you're going to call it ex5, so it'll be already set up. So that's all you have to do there. So that'll be done. You'll have that link there from your main file, and once you do that, you could just close this up. So just make sure you just copy the previous link, make sure you have it to ex5, close that up. That's all you have to do there. And then we'll make a new folder called ex5. ex5, that's all you have to do. And then in here, we're going to make two files, an index.html, we'll do that in the first video, and then we'll take care of our CSS in the second video. So let's make our index.html. So we'll just add a file. We'll call it index.html, and it should go there right away, and there's nothing there. So just put an exclamation point. Can't be easier than that. Exclamation point, and hit tab. And there's all our HTML we need to get started. For your title, just call it floating review or float review. I guess float is fine, it's less typing, just call it float review. And there's nothing in your body right now. That's all we should have to put up here, except we are going to make a link to our styles.css, but let's wait until we actually do that, and then we'll link to our styles.css. But let's get our HTML started. And this is pretty easy. We just have a couple things in your body here. We're going to make an H1. So I'll type H1 and hit tab and just put in float review. This is the heading that's going to show up on the page. And we're not going to do anything special with it. It'll just be left justified. And even if you hit run, you're going to see the old one, but if you click in here, you can see it says float review. But we're going to open this up in a new tab. So let me do that. Let me open this up in a new tab. And I'll even click on ex5 so we see float review. And then I can move this over here and off the page, so we don't even have to look at that. So there's our H1. And then we're going to make a div for container and then have 4 divs inside of there. And we're going to give them class names. So let's do that. Let's make our container first. We'll go largest to smallest. We're not doing any other footers or anything like that. We're just going to make a container, and we can make it a section. You can make it a div or a section. I'm going to say section, and if the class name of the section is going to be container, we just put a dot. So we put dot container. We don't put any space, and then we can just hit tab. And then it'll make a section element with the class name container, and then we can target dot container in our CSS. And I always like to put a return in between here so we keep the structure and it indents in here so we could see our open and closing. And remember, when we talk about parents, H1's parent is body, section's parent is body. And now whatever I put in here, the parent is going to be the section. So anything that's indented is the child of the parent, and that's going to be more apparent when we start working in here. But inside our container, we're going to put not just 4 paragraphs, but we're going to put 4 divs so we can make them align and have their own background colors and their own padding. So we're not just going to put paragraphs, we're going to put divs first, and we'll just call them boxes. So we'll put div.box1, and we'll give them individual names, and then we can just copy them, and we can put times 4. And whatever order you do this is fine, but I'm going to do that first. So I'm going to make 4 of them. So I'm going to make 4 divs with box1 name, and obviously we'll have to change the names, and we'll do that. So there's our 4 divs, and I'll change the names of them right away to box2, box3, and box4, kind of like what we did in the previous exercise. And I'll put my returns here so we could see the structure, because we're going to put stuff in there. And what's going to go in here is going to be paragraphs. And we can go right to the first one here. Now, if it goes out to the margin, I like to go in here and hit return, so then it's already indented. Now, it does put an extra space, which we can just backspace and get rid of it. So I'm going to put a P, and then this little arrow means a child, which is going to be lorem 20. We'll just put 20 words of lorem of dummy text. So we're going to put a paragraph, and inside there is going to be lorem ipsum with 20 words. So I'm going to hit tab, and that's it. And then what you could do is just you could copy these, or you could do it each time. And I'm going to hit return and paste it. Hit return after the opening div and paste it, and paste it. And if you don't want these extra spaces in here, you could just go here and backspace, which is fine. And now everything looks nice. And what I'm going to do next is just make sure this is working okay. So let me go here and do that. So we just have that. And now we're going to start doing our CSS. We're going to put those in little blocks, and we're going to make them responsive as we go throughout the page. Now, first of all, let's just make a CSS file, and then we'll link to it, and then we'll continue the CSS in the next video. So right now, I think we're done with our HTML. That's all we really need. And I'm just going to go here and make a new file inside this. So make sure you're on that when you hit add file. And then this is just going to be styles.css. And you don't have to call it styles. You could call it anything you want, but just make sure you link to the right name. And what we're going to put in here in our styles, we could just put a global reset, which is the asterisk, and just target the asterisk, and we'll just do margin :0 and a semicolon. And remember, the semicolon separates it from the next one. So if you ever miss a semicolon, it messes up things after it, because it doesn't know where it ends. It's like a sentence that just goes on and on. So we're just going to do padding like that. We can always do more resets, but those are just basic ones we can do in the beginning. So we'll just do global reset. And you can put a comment if you want about a global reset, or you can leave it out. Just put an extra space right now. And then we're going to put a style for container. We're going to put a style for our boxes. And before we do that, though, before I go on with the CSS, which I'm going to do in the next video, let's just make sure that we go here and we link to it. And I'm just going to put it before the title. I'm just going to put link, type link, and hit tab. And then inside here, I'm just going to put styles.css. And that's it. Make sure that name is exactly the same name as that. Make sure you don't mess that up. So that's all you have to do. So if I run this and I preview it, it should take away any margin and padding. It should all get jumbled together. And it does. It's all jumbled together. So I'm going to stop here. We'll pick up in part 2 and do all the CSS, which won't take that long. Again, it's just a review. So that's what we're going to do in part 2. We'll start working on our CSS, and we'll set up our container, and we'll set up our boxes, and then we'll set up some responsiveness, and we'll just talk about some of the naming schemes that we're using for this in part 2.